thought I was a perspicacious, eloquent Scotsman. There's two of us, and he's on with me. It's the one and only James Melville, born not 20 miles from my good self. It must have been something in the water or in the air. James, thanks for joining us. The end of Sturgeon. Something fishy about it, or did you see it coming?
Yeah, I saw it coming on a number of different fronts. I mean, there's obviously the whispers of police investigations about financing with the SNP and the government. There's also, I think, more importantly, that you touched on before, about the gender identification, which is basically undermining women's rights in Scotland. And there is a juxtaposition with that Nicola Sturgeon, and I say as someone who is sympathetic to the independent cause, someone like Sturgeon saying that we want freedom for Scots, but over the last 3 years has taken away asset stripping freedoms from Scottish people, not just on that draconian measure that's stripping away women's rights, but also the hate speech bill. And also, I think, an over-the-top draconian approach to the COVID restrictions. So where we've got with Sturgeon is that, and history's taught us this, George, politicians, in terms of leadership, they run out of steam when they get close to a decade. We saw it with Thatcher, where she got undone by the poll tax. We saw it with Blair. We got undone by an illegal war in Iraq. And we're seeing it with Sturgeon, with the sort of policy that most Scottish people, based on their understanding of freedom and liberty and liberalism, have rallied against. So I think she has destroyed herself with her own hubris. And what happens quite often with individuals who are in power too long is they cannot see the wood from the trees in terms of what is in keeping with the culture and society of the nation they're supposed to represent.
And yet, in her 50-minute resignation speech today, she didn't show any great signs of remorse or repentance. So if she gets to handpick the next leader of the Nationalist Party, it's going to be more of the same, isn't it?
It could be. It depends who they go for. I mean, the only bit of credit I would give to Nicola Sturgeon is that she was an election-winning machine. But that was understandable considering, you know, the plant of optics of votes in Scotland. So, for instance, you're going to get 45, 46% voting for independence, and you've got the other side splitting the vote. But there's a bigger picture here in terms of Sturgeon's legacy. Sturgeon, over the course of time, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, has run Scotland into the ground. And I say this as someone who is largely pro-independence. For me, I've got to separate out what's happening with the Scottish government and the bigger picture of independence. I'm sure we can squabble long into the night about independence, George. But if you look at standards in terms of education, health, infrastructure, crime, that is effectively what the Scottish government are there to represent Scottish people. They're paying their taxes to have good public services and infrastructures in Scotland. And on that measure, the most important measure, she has failed. When people write sort of history about Nicola Sturgeon and her legacy, they'll look at it two ways. They'll ask the question of what did she actually achieve in terms of policy? Not that much. What did she achieve in terms of winning elections? A hell of a lot. So I would rather have a politician who achieved positive legacy on effective policies for the nation that they're representing, rather than just blindly winning elections. You could have the same argument with Margaret Thatcher back in the day.
Well, even you would find it difficult to argue that when an independence party runs Scotland into the ground, we should reward them by giving them state power so they could run even more things into the ground. But that's a digression. I want to put to you a more challenging point, James, that I've seen argued in Spiked, is it Spiked, online this very evening, that Sturgeon and Ardern in New Zealand and Trudeau in Canada and Biden in the United States all these so-called liberals and progressives, and who are cheered by other so-called liberals and progressives, are in fact tyrants who have delivered tyranny into their own societies. The very opposite of what it says on the tin.
I would agree with that completely. But that's like the oldest trick in the political playbook, isn't it? It's the virtue con trick, where it's about, safety, security, convenience. That was shown throughout the measures of COVID. Shown with Trudeau with shutting down the bank accounts of peaceful protesters, the truckers. It was shown with Ardern in New Zealand, where ostracizing those who decided on a medical decision not to take vaccination. It's shown with Sturgeon, for instance, with the Hate Speech Act, and also in terms of gender identification. So and Biden, for instance, was still in America that you are having various elements of America that is operating in a two-tier system based on medical choice. So you've got these individuals who are wrapping around under the auspice of virtue, but it's actually the biggest con trick of them all. Because what's happening is these individuals, these corporatist politicians, combined with unethical corporations and unelected technocrats, are using this aspect of virtue to try and claw back assets, whether that be to do with energy, finance, wealth, power, whatever it might be. And one thing we need to learn over the last 3 years of this sort of bamboozlement is that these individuals do not have our best interests at heart. The only interest they have at heart is securing their own power and wealth for other individuals. If you look at, for instance, the last 3 years, we've got the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of the planet away from lower middle classes now as well to the 1%. And therefore we have to ask the questions why that happened. And the first aspect in terms of answering those questions is about government policy that's enabled this to happen. So I don't buy the sort of poster boys and poster girls of virtue, because basically it's the diametrically opposite of that. They're feeding virtue and using media to populate those messages. But in the meantime, our society is crumbling from an economic point of view, the cost of living crisis, but also in terms of an entrapment of the type of politician we need in our parliaments. We need politicians who are there fundamentally to serve the people, with no questions asked. They're there purely to serve the people. But currently we have a bunch of politicians who are enabling certain agendas from technocrats, corporate fulfillment, but at the same time feathering their own nests. I mean, if you look at the UK government with some of the sort of the whiff of cronyism and corruption around the PPE contracts, there's so many countries displaying this right now. And we as individuals need to look at these and think, well, they do not have our best interests at heart.
If you look around the so-called Western world, almost all the governments, almost all the politicians, if you look at Britain, for example, the Blairites, I would describe them as shorthand, centrist Blairites, control the Labour Party, but they also control the Conservative Party. The so-called Blairites have so infiltrated all of the organs of the British civil service, the mass media, the think tanks, the Whitehall, and so on. They are effectively a one-party state here in Britain, James.
Yeah, but it's happening in loads of places. I mean, I don't want to go down sort of rabbit holes of too many conspiracy theories here. I mean, Klaus Schwab, the WF, said we're penetrating cabinets around the world. But I think what's happened, whether it's through politics at a national level, also local government level, education, academia, and so on, we're creating this set of agendas, and I call it kind of wokeism agendas, whereby, like you, George, I sit on the left of centre, but this is not the model of the left of centre politics that I believe in. I've said this before on this show, that the left, has left me, but I haven't actually left the left. What I care about is giving a voice to the people who have been disenfranchised. And in this country, and in the Rust Belts of America and Canada and so on, Australia, New Zealand, and France, and Germany, our industrial areas have been hollowed out over the last 40 years by deindustrialization, and they haven't been replaced. And the voices of those communities have been completely forgotten. And we're now populated or penetrated, as Klaus Schwab said, by individuals who do not care about those communities. So whether it is a Labour government or whether it's been a Tory government, they keep coming up with the same empty rhetoric about northern powerhouses and levelling up and the rest of it, but nothing gets done in those communities. Now, I voted Remain, but the one argument I found really compelling on the Brexit side was that, in a way, it was a protest vote because those communities who voted for Brexit felt forgotten about. And yet those individuals in those communities were smeared at as either being thick or being racist or being bigoted. And I had no time for that argument. My argument on the Remain side was I wanted somewhere that wasn't political alignment. It was about keeping free trade to protect the economy. But I certainly understand the voices of all those lost communities in the northeast of England, northwest of England, Central Belt of Scotland, another perfect example, Rust Belt in America. And people have had enough of this, but where is the choice? So whether you vote Democrat or Republican in the States, Labour or the Tories in the UK, it's the same choice. Nothing changes. It's not a choice that people will accept. And so what happens is that individual communities get disenfranchised. They don't know who to vote for. There is not a valid alternative. And to summarize this rant,
Sure.
I think the majority of people in this country want roughly the same things. They want good infrastructures. They want good public services. They want hope for their communities and a future for their children. And right now, our main parties are not providing it.